Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cybersecurity Recruiter Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Norman. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well, Tom. How are you today? Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I am, mate. For everyone listening, me and Norman have just been chatting away off air, and we were talking about the little vacation, the little boys' trip. I was expecting you to come back worse for wear, but it sounds like it was a very mature, sensible, and relaxing trip, mate. Anyway.
Yes, it was. And as we were talking, what comes with age is a lot different experiences and what you might call exciting and rebellish. But yeah, being over 60, you take a little different approach on those trips. It was great. We were on a very nice, gorgeous lake with just trees and stuff around. Anchored a couple of houseboats and enjoyed some camaraderie, enjoyed some beverages, and just relaxed. Beautiful country. And the weather was immaculate. We were hit the remnants of a hurricane. It just missed us. We only had 20 minutes of rain. So Tom, I couldn't have asked for anything better. It was gorgeous. Way to get away. And the other unique thing is hardly any cell service. So we didn't really have that can work for these days.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you sure there wasn't any dongles and laptops kicking about anywhere?
There was a few people had cell service, but the priorities were football games, hockey games, texting these significant others.
Good. Yeah, they're good. I think it's good. And sometimes it's nice to solidify and collect your thoughts, and sometimes like additional clarity on where you're going or your best ideas come when you're in those scenarios.
Yes, it is. I've been an advocate. It's not being isolated, but solitude, a little bit of that me time away from all the stimuli of life, all the things we do, and clearing the mind can be helpful. I think sometimes we don't do it as much as we should. But
it can. Do you know what? I'm great at talking about it on the podcast and giving all this great advice, and it's so true. And then I go off and work like an animal and never do it, and then wonder why I get sick and semi-burnt out now and again. But I need to probably listen back to some of the episodes and maybe this one and actually take it, because it's easy to give it. It's not always easy to do it.
turn out harder, but smarter means taking care of yourself too. So you probably should go back and listen to them.
Right, mate. Look, I'm going to do you a bit of an intro. So Norman Kromberg, for everyone listening to the show, I've got a hell of an intro to do here. You started off back in the mid-'80s. You've come a long way since you was an assistant cashier at Lancashire Country Bank, Norman. You were then a national bank examiner, and then you eventually progressed on to your first role as an information technology auditor for First Tier Financial. You were then got into a lead role as a lead business analyst for First National Bank of Omaha. You then were a vice president at First Data Corporation. You were there for almost a decade, started in the kind of mid to late 90s. You were then a project director at TB Amateur Trade. You were then a management consultant. You were also a technology audit leader. And then you then progressed on to West Interactive. You were started off as the VP of Quality Improvement and then progressed on to the VP of Information Security. You were also a director at Alliance Data. You were then a VP of Global Information Security and Chief Security Officer at AIC Worldwide. You then went on to be an executive director and CISO of Executive Solutions at Optiv. You were then a VP of Security at Southern Carlson. You were then at NetSpy. You started off as a MD, Managing Director, and then progressed on to be the CISO. You are currently involved with various different things. You are the CyberEdBoard executive member at CyberEdBoard community. You've done that for over 6.5 years. You're a fellow ambassador, founder of Information Technology Fellow. That's a current position you hold. You're also the founder, CEO, and CISO of SOMIS. That's a current position you hold. You're the strategic advisor of Wolfpack Security, and you're also a board member of advisors at TrustCloud. Norman, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Didn't realize how long that would take until you started doing that. Seemed like it was shorter in real life than it was to read.
Listen, it's good. And I know we've always talked on and off for a while, Norman, and whenever we chat, we have a nice, engaging conversation. I always feel like I take something away from the chat. Even just now, before we were coming on air, we were talking about various different aspects of security, whether it's offensive or compliant. And I always feel like you give me little nuggets of information, mate, that are genuinely always really valuable. So I know the listeners are going to get a lot from this. But before we dive in, I'll start where I always start. I know I've done you an intro, but I can never do it as well as you. But who are you, and what do you get up to, and what's a day in the life like of Norman?
Well, interesting question. I guess one thing I'd add to the background that you may not have picked up is my degree was in finance and management. So I'm not necessarily a technician by degree, but you heard the evolution from the assistant cashier at Lancaster County Bank all the way up. So I've combined this technical experience later in career with an early foundation in business and banking. So what's a day in the life look like? It varies. I got to tell you, it changes with those roles I have now. I do serve as an advisor for a couple of organizations. I do serve as a contributor to things like Fellow and CyberEdBoard. So it's what's the current topics? What is the insight that people need from those topics? What can I contribute? I'm also working as a virtual CISO for a couple of firms, still seeking another potential CISO gig if it matches what I want to do with that background I've got. The day varies from meetings, discussions like this, which I really get energized by, doing a fair amount of reading, looking at the standards of NIST, ISO, PCI, HIPAA, GLBA, GDPR, all of that. Spending time with my family, my fiance, our dogs, being a football fan. So this time of year gets even busier between college and pro football. And we also enjoy fine dining and wines. For example, I have 2,300 bottles of wine in my wine cellar.
Wow.
It's in too. I don't know if that helps with what my day is, but it's insightful. And I do take time to break a while and relax.
Yeah, cool. Look, I think if you'd have told me you had 2,300 bottles of wine in your cellar a few days ago, I think we'd have been recording this one in person together over at your house, mate.
You know what? It's an enjoyable thing. And I have found that wine is a great avenue for networking and discussion because there are so many nuances to it. And sometimes those nuances I pull up can say, hey, if you think about this in the security world, the technical world, matter of fact, one of my close friends who has 2 to 3 times the number of bottles I do is an ex-CIO, CTO, very influential, has done well for himself. And we are both technicians, but we're also cork dorks. We love our
Yeah, I'm probably going slightly off topic here, but I will do. But yeah, when me and my 2 sisters and my mum and my stepdad, we were down in New Zealand a while ago. We went to Australia for 2 weeks and we went to New Zealand for 2 weeks. We did a full month down there. We were on a wine tour in New Zealand and we got to the end of this wine tour. We drank far too much. And of course, they came out and asked us if they wanted to buy anything. And I think my sister ended up purchasing something like 3 or 4 months of it was just coming to her house in London for just months and weeks on end. She'd pre-ordered all that. But anyway, it was great fun, but we drank far too much.
Is when I do go on our tasting trips, like to Napa, Sonoma, we've done it in Italy. I've done a few other places. I always spit. So if you notice, there's no spit. And I do that because the first time I ever went, by the end of the day, what I was buying, probably not the best values I should have been buying. So I learned my lesson there. And I just reserved the deeper consumption for meals and away from the buying trips.
Yeah, cool. Okay, good. I didn't think we were talking about wine, but it's quite nice to talk about it. But we've got a few things to discuss today. Now.
Yep.
What I'd really like to get into, I was just saying to you before we went on air, I didn't realize how long you'd been at your seniority level. You've been at VP level from memory since kind of the middle 90s. So you've got a hell of a lot of experience in leadership, whether that's at VP level, at CISO level, at board member level. What advice have you got for, there'll be a lot of people listening that are maybe in mid or even quite senior level roles that want to get up to where you are now. There'll be fellow leaders listening as well that are looking for kind of words and wisdom. Bit of a like double question, but how do I get to the very senior kind of VP CISO level? And when I do get there, any tips, hints, or things that now that you wish you maybe knew, 5-10 years ago, or maybe more?
Interesting question, because it causes one to reflect and go back. So the first thing that came to mind is know yourself, know who your skills are. If you noticed, I just referenced my business degree. That adds a different component to my ability to be a CISO, to be head of these organizations. Because what I found is chief information security officers in a lot of cases don't have that experience from a business standpoint. Okay, what's a balance sheet? What's an income statement? No, the ultimate equation that drives almost every organization in the world of business is income minus expense equals net profit. And Tom, I use that equation a lot. So understanding yourself in the sense of what your skills are and what they are not. Then as you're looking to move up, ask yourself and go, what culture and environment are you the most comfortable in? And that can change over your career. But when I say that, are you comfortable with the structure and the bureaucracy of a Fortune 100 or 500 or 1,000? I'm sure you run into this when you're doing the recruiting. Are you comfortable in the entrepreneurial startups and those leaders of those organizations? These individuals have bet their family, their lives, their financial whatever on this business. And man, they have a pretty tight window and they are a different evaluation than you would in that Fortune 100. Get the ones in between that might be VC backed, private equity backed. Okay, what's that culture? What's that environment? How do your skills, your desires fit into that? And then what is your strength? Is it technology? Is it governance? Is it compliance? Is it business alignment? Knowing that, and then what do you need to diversify to move up? And the other thing is pay attention to what's changing as part of our pre-conversation. Face it, we're in an interesting time in the cybersecurity world. I think we're facing a time when we're going to continue to see pullback. I think fewer and fewer CISOs are being hired, or the CIOs are taking on that CISO role. There's CISOs taking on the CIO role. So we're seeing a consolidation. I think we'll continue to see that trend happen. There'll be closer focus on the investment. Why? Because I don't know that the fear, uncertainty, and doubt mantra of the past 20 years has manifested itself. And then I'd also say, look at how diversified you are. You mentioned I was a regulator. I was an auditor. I've done some consulting. I've been in 20 plus industries, either through consulting or working, different risk profiles. All of that's led up to the ability to think through and put in context why we are doing security, what does it mean to the org, and how to structure the program. So it's fascinating. I don't know if I answered your question exactly how you would anticipate. Things I would recommend somebody look at.
Yeah, no, thanks, Norman. And I really hear what you're saying on the degree in finance and management. I think that's really true. I think people probably gloss over the fact that they need to have that financial acumen, that commercial awareness. I'm just thinking back to a VP of security role that we were working on recently, and the emphasis around essentially being able to get your arms around that P&L was just absolutely huge. And so many people, I mean, I personally know I did about 50 interviews for this role to generate a shortlist of 3 people. And it was hard to find people that had that level of awareness. It really resonates what you're saying.
Yeah, I've got a story for you. I was sharing that same point with somebody a few weeks back, and they were talking about a growth company that was putting in new restaurants or new stores. I can't remember which, but the point will be the same. And the CIO, who had a really good business acumen, came in to the meeting, and it was a vendor trying to sell something. Let's say it was $100,000 per year for the cost of the technology. And the CISO had endorsed it, his team had. And then in this meeting, the CIO goes, it cost us $100,000 of expense to stand up each new location. And we are now on a target to grow at this rate. And we're probably gonna do one every month, he said. So you're asking me to give up one of those growth stores for this technology. And it was a security tool. Say it was endpoint protection. They weren't ready to answer the question of why is this important enough to sacrifice the growth of the business? And you have to keep in mind, the expense we are spending for security is really there, not for the benefit of the company, but to ensure it stays. If you think about it, the company's not profitable or successful, that security expense doesn't mean anything. It's going to be there. So I thought that was fascinating to hear that story, how quickly that technical person was able to transfer the expense into direct impact on the company's ability to succeed over the long haul.
Yeah, and I think if you've got the ability to do it, it's such an underrated skill. It's just, if you can articulate that correctly in a concise, clear manner, you're going to do well, Norman, aren't you?
Yeah, and take it even to the more challenging levels. If you're going in and it's not a direct expense like that, where you can tie it to one store, but where, okay, you got the trade-off of saying you're going to do a proof point versus the embedded email protection of Microsoft, which you can get through your E5s. Now you're going to go price, how many E5s do you have? What's that mean? What are those broader benefits? That's where you need to partner with technology versus the pure cost of proof point. And proof point's just an example. It can be Mimecast, it can be other email protection, but how do you figure those costs against? That's where your budgeting piece comes in that says, okay, is this worth it? Or can I get to 75% with this? And is that okay? Or what's the marginal risk impact?
Yeah, and I think just understanding margins and understanding cost per head and understanding how everything gets watered down and squeezed when you scale and being able to track that. There's a lot to it.
I'll pull back to my banking experience. When I had to get commissioned as a bank examiner, I was required to go through the full test. It's like the CPA exam or the bar exam. And in that, I had to still show proficiency for looking at loan files and risk rating balance sheets and income statements of loan people who took out the loans. So I still go back to that ability to risk rate the loans and the ability to pay, transfer that into how we invest and how we look on security and IT. There's some parallels there. And
Mm, mm.
understanding that risk is helpful to me and has been over the years.
Yeah, good. Yeah. I think coming in from that, you've not really come into security in the traditional way, but I think it's benefited you.
Oh yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
And that's the evolution and pivot point for me was when Sarbanes-Oxley hit. I will tell you, the
Mm,
ability to understand the business side and say, okay, in technology and security, we're really dealing with general controls, not a balance sheet or an income statement line item. Then you had to evaluate on a macro layer, but what's the importance of that macro layer? So it involves some conversations with the auditors doing attestations, the CFO, CEO, because they were the ones doing the attempt on the design of the controls and that it was in place and operating.
mm.
So yeah, it's been valuable.
Yeah, good. I think if people are listening, I think if you haven't come in the way that you've come in, which I don't think a lot of people listening will have done, and you're leading a GRC department and you've come up through the ranks or on the offensive side, whatever it is, I think if you've not come in through that commercial kind of financy way, we're living in the age of the internet. You maybe know better than me what to look at, Norman. There's stuff's out there, isn't it? If you allocate the time over a consistent, sustained period of time, I'm imagining you can upskill. I don't know how quickly. Maybe you could help us on that, but the information's there if people want to go and absorb it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Sources, when we still had regular newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Business Week, those were prevalent. Now, MSNBC, CNBC, those kinds of business broadcasts will help. Reading now the more electronic version of the business side. I think it was CNBC every morning does a segment on technology, but it's around the rest of the business one. Listening to those, actually reaching out as part of your networking. Do you spend time in your technical world or do you try to go over onto the business side? Every time I've run a security function or an IT function or even an IT audit function, one meeting I had every month was with my dedicated accountant from our finance team. And we'd go through all of our expenses and stuff and have that conversation. And I would pose questions to them. I tried to have my team there so they could pick up some of that conversation and that knowledge. To your point is one way you can mitigate this. Who do you put on your team? Talked about pen testers. One thing I wouldn't do is put a whole bunch of pen testers on my security team. One or two is great, but then I want some people who've been in that business world like myself that can complement their skills as you build the team out. Or how do you procure services? If you aren't big enough to hire a team, what are the skills and capabilities of the service provider you're using?
Yeah. I think it's amazing how when you do start absorbing that knowledge, whether it's in the Wall Street Journal or watching the various business channels, you start picking up that it's amazing what you do absorb. Some of my friends know work in a brokerage in the city in London, and they're all told to read the Financial Times every morning before they start because it just gets the right conversations going with their clients. But I think it's, yeah, if you're going onto these calls and just talking about popping a shell or whatever it might be, it's probably not going to be very relatable to some of these guys and girls.
Yeah. And one of the biggest impacts to security lately has been ransomware. Let's face it, ransomware is a financial transaction and
Mm,
it's a financial risk calculation. Are you going to
mm,
pay the criminal money, the ransom for your data or
mm,
for whatever they've done? Think about it. When you kidnap somebody, you always get a ransom note, or you should get a ransom note. Same logic. Is it worth spending the money to get that? Or can you somehow do other procedures to get out of the situation? That's a financial discussion. And
mm,
that's also important to know as you do your IT structures, your security structures. How long can you be down? I mean, I've been in
mm.
organizations where it surprised me. We have, something offline for 4 to 5 days because we didn't have a single point of failure and it just didn't have the business impact. So we learned that,
Wow.
adjusted our program that way. So
Wow. Yeah. 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 I think the other thing is it's interesting as well. I think learning all about this and the finance, I find it just as interesting as the security side. And it sounds like you do, mate, to be fair.
oh, yeah, I do. Because
Yeah.
what you learn and understand in all these industries, going from what is the critical strategies for a not-for-profit that's dedicated to fundraising or investing other people's monies and grants, to a manufacturing firm that has to worry about just-in-time supplies and materials to build out what they do, financial institutions who are exposed to the most liquid of funds around the globe. What do they have to protect? Higher education, what is their issue? What are they facing on their business cycles too? And we have to understand the business cycle. Post-secondary is generally, you got semesters, start in the fall, end in the winter. This one starts early or late winter, ends in the spring. They get the summer as their downtime. Retail, the holidays. So they go through that period. As in banking, it was daily cycles. You posted everything at night. You had the weekends, do all your changes. It's all that. What's that cycle? What's that flow? And how can you introduce the change? Part of that, Tom, is as you do your security work, knowing that to then say, what are the indicators of threats? When something happens, is it an anomaly? Is the anomaly tied to the business, or is it truly an outsider or somebody coming in to try to do something? If you don't have that understanding of the business, you're going to lose some response time.
Yeah.
And having that pretty key, or know where to go ask for it, how quickly you go to the CFO, the COO or CEO with these basic questions.
Yeah, when I hear you talking like that in such a kind of holistic way, it makes me realize how, if we go back to pen testing, if you're just doing pen testing, I can imagine it's so easy to get sectioned off in your little world. And you talk about part of the application or something, or part of the business being down for 4 days and it perhaps not being the be all and end all. It's like really taking a step back and actually thinking about every aspect of security, the commercial side, the finance side. It's security as a whole, really, isn't it? It's proper security, if you like.
Yeah. And that's why I use the term, when I ask about security, I just go to the multi-layer defense and depth strategy. And it's the layers that complement each other. And pen testing, offensive testing play a role in that, as does identity, operating, your security operations center, your application development, your incident response, your governance. All of those play into that multi-layer, but knowing how much each layer is critical and where to invest in, it goes back to that business side. What you invest in. I was at an organization where we didn't invest in pen testing. Why? Because we had small margins. Any dollar was sacrificed to the margin. We just couldn't afford it. Other places, it became a core component of that information we needed to know where we wanted to fine tune those other layers. So do you have the right strategy relative to your business structure, your success factors there?
Yeah, no, thanks, Norm. So yeah, just to summarize on people getting into leadership, the commercial awareness, the financial acumen, find out if you want to be in Fortune 500 or startups, is your strength in tech, and really find out where you're going to be strongest and just really focus on getting that additional commercial rounded awareness. Norm, I'm just going to move on to some stuff that I'd really like to talk about. And I know we've previously talked about this before, about report writing, technical writing, presenting findings. This is becoming, for everyone listening as well, this is becoming so valuable for employers, like especially MSPs or MSSPs or people working on a consultancy basis. Like when I'm engaging a new client, I'm hearing it again and again, please send us people that can talk, that know how to communicate and articulate themselves in a written format to business people. Quite a long-winded way of saying, have you got any advice, Norman? How do we present findings? How do we get better at technical writing? How do we get better at communicating in a business world?
Great question. So a couple of thoughts. First off, I got lucky. When I was a bank examiner, we were required to write extensive reports. I'm not the best writer, so they got me into some classes, and I had one or two mentors who helped me understand the style of writing. And it was the 5 W's: what we did, why we did it, what we found, what the receiving organization has to do, and what we were going to do. Those 5 W's, if you can think about that as you put together your business communication, and also understand you're writing in business, you're writing novels or fiction or entertainment. So keep that in mind. The other thing is, understand, I mentioned it before, culture. Tom, I've been in front of I don't know how many boards of directors and executive teams, knowing what their DNA is. And I'll tell you, recently I was at one where I'd worked with the head of IT, the head of security and all this, and we pared it down to be 34 pages. The president of the organization wanted to go to the next level of detail. So we totally misread. I would say it was less me. They totally didn't catch the person's desire would be go into this detail. So we had to pull back a little bit, come in with some more supporting detail. We had it. We just didn't have it in the presentation. I share that as the example of knowing your audience, your context. And then, especially in these roles, can you articulate it as you're talking to your grandmother or a 5-year-old? I know that sounds cliche. I put it in this way. Can you simplify out of the tech speak? And here's an example. This is dating me a bit. I was actually in a conversation where we were talking about networks and things like that. It was when I was in banking. And the conversation went like this. We're using ATM to drive our ATMs, asynchronous transmission mode to drive automated teller machines. You use the same acronym, means two different things in one sentence. You imagine the non-technical person going, what did they just say? Yeah. So I think being able to simplify it to the most basic of conversations, and this is where we're guilty, buzzwords, AI right now, it's artificial intelligence. I like to use the example, guys, it's been around for a long time. If you look at credit card fraud detection, they've been using algorithms to determine how to authorize a transaction for decades. We just have more compute power, better data. Things can move faster and more efficiently in that realm. When we hear zero trust, to me, that's as simple as it's least privilege, need to know, and you can draw comparisons to that. So I even use analogies back to the Wild West. People used to rob banks all the time. Why? Because they were easy to get into. What did they do? They put in big safes and bars on or cages for the tellers. They stopped going to rob banks and they went to other things. That evolution continued. I think that helps in the report writing, the communication of issues, putting it into that context, but you got to know who's in the room. Also pick who the board members are, the executive team, what's their profile. We have LinkedIn now. I would look at that on a regular basis to see where they're involved. You brought up mine. Take advantage of these capabilities to know what is the context.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think a lot of what you're saying is like listening skills, like say, knowing the culture, like you say. I think the other thing as well, though, I'm sure you found as well, what I found is if you can't articulate these things well and you do use too many buzzwords or the C-suite or senior stakeholders don't understand, in my experience, they just switch off and then you might not get back in front of them for God knows how long, or they might just not sign it off.
Yeah.
It is like that.
If we were talking compliance, I think I could rattle off 10 acronyms in 30 seconds or less. And to your point, most executives had no idea what I just said. So it's what's behind all that too, to my point, simplify it. Can you articulate the why, what this is? But you have to be ready to react to my example with the person who wanted the detail. Know your stuff just because you can write it, but you need to know the detail behind it. What also comes to mind is respect. The two most powerful tools in the security world today. I would even contend these are the most powerful tools in IT, the most used. And by far, nobody's proven to me otherwise. Those tools are Excel and PowerPoint. Is that use Excel for the analytics to transfer all this knowledge into some sort of common theme? Generally, you're looking at 1 to 2 pages. PowerPoint's your mechanism to present. I've seen very few people use Word for that presentation. You may use it for the levels down to provide all the details. So you mentioned pen testing report. To me, your goal is a efficient, succinct PowerPoint that can lead an executive through the story, supported by a powerful Word document that has all the details, that was supported with a spreadsheet of results and things like that that came out of all the exercise you had done. So if you think about it, it's the pyramid up to the top. And I reference those tools because they're the most used ones in that communication flow.
Yeah, no, thanks, Norman. Yeah, like you say, and for everyone listening, like all this stuff, it's just so key, and I just don't think it's talked about enough. I try and talk about it a lot on the pod, and I think it's starting to get talked about more. But it's just everything in terms of leadership, progression, building your way up that seniority to level. It's just massive. But yeah, all right, in terms of like report writing and stuff like that, we've talked a bit about what a good and a bad report looks like. I know we mentioned before about rules of engagement documents and stuff like that. And you get asked a lot, what's a good one look like? What's a bad one look like? Can you give us some insights and detail and hints and tips on that, buddy?
On the rules of engagement, it's either rules or engagement or statement of work. What I look at is, and I use this even in conversations, I will repeat back what I heard. So I think in a good rules of engagement or statement of work, restate the scope, restate what you heard the need was or was agreed to, or the engagement. That's key. Are we doing an application test? Are we doing a network test? Are we looking at attack surface management? We do a red team. Are we going to be remote? We're going to be on site. Just, okay, what was their motivation for this? Was it because they had just been hacked or breached? Is it because they're meeting a compliance standard? Is it because they are managing risk and want another set of perspectives? Just understanding that. Is it a brand new area? There's times I've been part of engagements where we are looking at places like Hong Kong. We have to separate things. So we're very cognizant. So simply, what is the mission or the vision or the scope of that exercise? Then I would be clear as to articulate the how. So if you go back to the 5 W's I talked about, start building from that. What are we going to do? That's that first one. How are we going to do it? What is the process, the approach, the methodology? And that includes the timelines, the number of people, the tools you're going to use, whether it needs to be confidential to the organization or not, because then you limit the communication flow. Getting all that embedded in there so you get some pretty good clarity of what that exercise is going to accomplish. And talk about how you're going to communicate results. Do they want to see them right away so they can see if their operations center or their teams have seen the behavior that have been exhibited? Do they want to hold it and then communicate one mission? So get that down as to how the tactical issues shared and get clarity on that. Because if you're in a large organization, you may have to ask the question, how many groups are involved? Who wants to see it? Things of that nature. And then what's the formal reporting process? Who gets it? What levels? Back to my pyramid before, if you think about that tying in. And then obviously include things like cost, stuff like that, and the good rules of engagement or statement of work. But that's the way I would approach it.
I love listening. It's funny when I always end up learning stuff from one of the benefits of doing this pod is it's helped my own self-development. And when I'm listening to you there, I can actually, when you talk about confirming things and resend, I can actually relate it to taking an assignment order or a job order in recruitment because it is that's do you reconfirm it just verbally or would you reconfirm it straight after in like a written doc as well before you draw everything up or?
And I've learned this over the years. I confirm it right away in the conversation we're having. So go back and say, here's what I heard or how I interpret what you heard. So you say it there. I'll tell you just by repeating it, locks it into your mind to a degree. Then I would generally capture it in that statement of work or that document to make sure. Then you get to the broader one of what we're going to approach and go, do you feel this captures what you wanted to have done? And by the way, that scope then gets confirmed out in the reports and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's really good because we've had it. And I don't know if you've experienced this in your various roles over the years, but I've had it where you'll speak to one stakeholder and they'll want something. And then you'll speak to another one and they'll want something else. And you obviously learn over the years to think of different ways to mitigate that. But I think what you're saying about reconfirming it, having written confirmation there and then, I can see that making a big difference over the course of multiple engagements and things like that. I can really having a nice structure there. I can see the benefits from a recruitment or a pen testing or any form of security or consulting business, really.
Keep in mind, though, I'm going back to what we talked about on the intro. That's what I learned as a bank examiner because we had to write reports there. I learned that in audit because you are dealing with telling somebody what was wrong. So you had to articulate the scope. When I was doing engagements in Sarbanes and consulting, you always had to do that. So it's fundamental business communication. I don't think I'm blazing a trail that's particularly innovative or new. But I got to tell you, sometimes those fundamentals are powerful in keeping that in mind.
They are. And I think when you've been doing the job a long time, you think you don't need them anymore. You think you can skip them out. You think you're too clever and good. And then it comes to bite you one day.
I'm hearing on pen testing a lot because we've been referencing that. Automated pen testing. The same thing still applies, but you may be doing it continuously. So you change the how to its ongoing regular. So you just define those terms. You still want the what. You change the how. Then you get into the communication of the results. So you can still apply it to this evolution. I still think it applies even to AI stuff. When you think about it, what are we trying to do? How are we going to do it? It's pretty grounding when you get down to it. But if you're thinking of the writing of it, which generally occurs at the end, at the start, it really helps that mindset. Maybe that plays into some of the thing we talked about from developing your career and all that too.
Yeah, definitely, mate. I'm going to dive into some of the stuff you're doing at the minute now. But before we do, we talked a bit about the market a bit before. I think maybe a few months back, we had a good chat about the market and where security is going. And I think you've got some really good insights at one point, which was just ridiculous when you think about it. If a tech company's revenue was going up, no matter if they were making any money or not, if their revenue was going up and they were raising money, their valuation was just going up as well. And it was just crazy at one point. And those days seem to have come to an end, at least for now. But it'd be nice. I know people are always fascinated by market information and where it's going in terms of security, but yeah, what's your head at with what's going on at the minute? Where do you see things over the next kind of 6, 12, 18 months? What do you think's going on out there?
What I think is going on, and I'll use this term, and I tend to be a country, or somebody used the term unicorn the other day for me. I think we're in a
Mhm.
cybersecurity recession. And a good part of that recession is not necessarily tied to the other economic factors. I think it's tied to CEOs, CFOs, people taking a look at their financial statements in the situation saying, wait a minute, do we really need to keep spending all this energy, time, money, people, process, technology, however you want to describe it, on security? And I think they're starting to ask the critical question, which is why we're seeing a number of CISOs, me being an example, leaving organizations generally for financial reasons. I know several of them that have faced that. And it's not because of performance, it's the financial. And security is one area where it's a pure expense to the bottom line. So I think we're seeing a pullback on that. So then they're going to be challenged. Those who remain in the roles are going to be challenged. How do we optimize the spend? Do we really need this next technology? And AI coming in and all this, I've had this question from 3 different CFOs over my career recently. If you want to invest in this, what are we going to take away? What comes out? And it's a challenge because you have to be thinking, okay, if I say this, what's that risk profile and all this? So I think it's a challenging market. So you're going to have to be really intelligent about those layers, where you want to invest and all that. So I think we're going to continue to see that consolidation. The other challenging piece is I was told there's over 8,000 security companies that exist globally. Tom, the
Yeah,
market can't support 1,000 companies.
yeah.
And I think we're seeing technology companies, CDW being an example, Accenture, IBM, Google, Microsoft, even AWS acquiring security companies. We're seeing that in the news almost every day, somebody being bought by a tech
Mm,
company. I think we're
mm.
seeing that motivation come in to say, okay, is pure play security really the future, or is it enablement of the business through a technology partner that has across the board capabilities? They may continue to acquire these startups, these firms to broaden that out. That's what business has done for years. So that's my take on it right now. That may play into the question you're coming up now. How do you want to place yourself? How do you put yourself in as the driver and the leader in that conversation versus the victim?
Yeah, definitely. No, the CISO conversations really interesting. I know from conversations I'm having out there, I feel like so many CISOs are being basically asked to do the same with way less, expecting the same level of security and expecting everything to be sorted, but with maybe half the budget. It's tough.
It is. And but you know how then when you get your budget cut, what are you going to respond to? Have you thought about that when you signed agreements? Can you get out of them? Which one can't you?
Mm,
Are you going to cut staff? I'll tell you, funding multi-factor in one organization before, and we'd really done a good job of highlighting the need because the CFO and the CEO are supportive. So the conversation got down to who are they going to let go to fund it because they couldn't sacrifice the margin. They let a couple people go from a recent acquisition. They weren't even technical people. They were on the business side. If that gives you an idea of how they were looking at that decision, budget gets tight.
mm.
Where is that going to come from? Now I'm back to how do you communicate the situation? How do you conversation going and what options are out there you haven't talked to yet, i.e.
Mm.
staff reductions in other areas, other tools going away in favor of what you may do on security.
Yeah. Do you think normally could be forever change? I feel like compliance is pretty hot at the minute, and maybe that'll carry on, maybe it won't. My thought process is whatever area you're in, keep looking around, keep constantly upskilling, keep refining your communication skills. Do you think it's about just, and I suppose preparing to be pretty adaptable, or just trying to just work out where the next kind of area of demand within security is going to come from? What are your thoughts?
It's an interesting way you put that because that's in essence what we do in security. We're constantly looking for the next threat, exposure, anomaly for what to respond to. I would say, yeah, look for it in security, but also look for it in technology. Now, an interesting theme that somebody said to me, it told to me several times, seems like the security professionals have a better knack for networking, talking, and interfacing with peers outside their company. Maybe it's natural. We're all searching for that next issue, that next thing, and we're free to talk about it. Can you do that within the org to say, do you want to go into the other technology areas, the audit areas, the governance, risk, and compliance areas, things like that? So thinking on that broader scale, I think would be valuable as you're planning out your career and those facets. And even looking at the consulting firms, I think another theme is the virtual or fractional CISO sector is growing, as is the fractional CFO. I know a firm here in Omaha that's CFO Systems. That's what they do. And they're doing really well at it. Why? Because companies get high caliber talent at a manageable cost. So I think that's going to play into this too. So can you be comfortable being a subject matter expert in a firm that focuses on that, like one who does pen testing? I don't know why anybody would hire their own pen testers today when you go hire them from a firm that specializes in that. So you get somebody who's experienced in each of the facets. Things to consider as you go through this.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that area, whether it's hiring a consultancy company in or getting contractors, I know firsthand that side of things is still busy because it's part of the service offering that we provide. And the man who understands finance, Norman, you'll know what I say when I talk about this. I've seen it before where companies are gearing up for an IPO or a valuation, and they want to keep permanent salaries show up on the balance sheet as a liability. And contractors don't, because it's just an invoice coming from a recruitment company like ours at a later stage down the line, or a pen testing consultancy or whatever it might be. So they're not showing up on the balance sheet as a liability, which makes the valuation look better, which is favorable for exits and IPOs and so on and so forth. So there's a multitude of different reasons why these things get used. And in a choppy market, they get used even more, don't they?
And that reminds me of one thing I've run into is understanding the difference between capital expense and operating expense, because that plays into who is your owner, what is their motivation. So if you're an equity-backed firm, they're going to prefer CapEx because it has a different impact on EBITDA. If you're owned by a multinational global company, say a GE or something, you're just acquired by them, they may not be as interested in the CapEx versus the pure operating expense management. And it's easier for them to take on the OpEx because they can spread it out over time on a different capability. Just being in sync with the financial teams and those factors there plays into this too. And it's harder and harder to get CapEx in the security world today because everything's subscription. So, and you're going to cloud-based, and that's in essence subscription too.
Yeah. And just the goals of different companies. Like my sister's worked for loads of different startups, and you hear different things that go on behind the scene. And sometimes all they're thinking about is making sure they get that Series B or that Series C raised. That is all the goal is. Nothing else matters.
Well, and it's interesting. That is very correct. But you also, anybody who's publicly traded who has to do quarterly reports or quarterly disclosures, they're worried about the next quarter. So there will be decisions made at the end of each quarter to help on that equation. Very few go to the broader scale. And living in Omaha, we have Warren Buffett here, who's the classic long-term investor, not as concerned quarter to quarter, looking at more of the sustainable. So there's another culture you can have account for in all of these scenarios. So you're right. It's the motivation. My point, know who you work for and which one are you the most comfortable in.
Yeah. Just going back to the culture thing, I know you really mentioned that about 15 minutes ago, Norman, about how understanding the culture is key, and you gave a real life example. I think in the US, I think this stuff matters so much because and I've said this on podcasts before, but I'll say it again, but if I'm dealing with a client, thinking of one now in New York, he is very different from, say, a different client I've got in Texas or a different client I've got in Virginia. It's like dealing with different culture. Almost every state is like a different country. People are so different. People on the West Coast are very different to people on I think there's so much diversity amongst different types of cultures in America because it's so big and there's so many different states. It's not like in the UK where it's tiny and within reason it's all fairly similar. I think there's a lot to think about in the US. It's like dealing with loads of different countries.
And but still, you're highlighting as you make your choice in where you want to be, note the culture of the country you're in. I was at Southern Carlson, whereas that was acquired by Kyocera. We go from equity backed in the US, privately held, to owned by one of the largest conglomerates in the world with a very strict Japanese structure and culture. You pivot on a dime because one day you're this, one day you're that, next. And their culture moves slower, more methodical in a different fashion. You're right. No one, again, it's not just in the US, it's to me globally, know the culture you're in, and it's a country level as well as the business level.
Yeah, cool. No, I feel like we're having a really good chat about stuff here. It's good, mate. And there's so much, and it's sometimes the reason I like to talk so much about this is what my clients are saying, this is what my client, because I sometimes worry that technical people listening might be like, oh, do I really need to, especially like people breaking in or maybe at mid-level, they might think, why does it matter why I write like that and speak like it matters for everyone listening? It matters so much. And like, I know some good people that just haven't progressed because that they're talking to their peers or their colleagues or C-suite on the team like they talk to their friends, or they're writing emails internally like they're WhatsApping their friends, and it just doesn't equal career growth within security. So I love to harp on about it.
It's interesting. And knowing who you are comes into this for me, especially. I've made the choice years ago. When you went through that scenario, it was about 04, 05. I go, and I was mentored and coached by a friend of mine. And he said, now's your point where you can choose to be a CEO. And I ventured out to a couple of roles, and I determined quickly I didn't have that interest or that desire. So you have to understand what your desire and your motivation is. I quickly learned. So I pulled back and chose the path that I have come down. So also knowing who you are and where that plays into those positions. So if I'm okay with somebody who's fine sitting in a highly technical certain role, because they are as big a contributor to the company as the CEO is at times. You'd be amazed at what they can handle and what they can do. In that case, your written skills and all that is different than if you're pursuing the other one. So I wanted to follow that up from what you were saying is know who you are and how you best adapt. And there's nothing wrong with being who you are.
Definitely. I think understanding what you want as well, because I think a lot of people still looking at Norman when you was a VP or in your CISO role that you're doing now or at NetSpire, they might think they want it, but do they? Because it's a lot of, like I said, the trappings and the finance and the money that comes with it's great, but there's a lot of other stuff that comes with it, and you'll know better than most. I always say to people when they're stepping into leadership, even if I'm recruiting for a leadership role and it's advantageous for them to be going that way, I'm always like, listen, are you sure? Because it's not for everyone.
Yeah, it's the choice. And I'll tell you, I've managed a number of incidences in my career, and you're the one generally as the CISO who's going to make that final statement. Yes, we have an incident. The minute you make that statement or you are asked to drive it, you're now the incident commander. You've just given up everything you've been planning for the next week or two to be there and to drive it, to be involved. And that then trickles down to the rest of the team. And a lot of CEOs spend 7 days a week at their job. And it may appear glamorous, but it's taxing on them. So understand it, pay attention to it.
I bet communication comes into his own in a situation like that.
Very much so.
Yeah, and I bet it always happens at the worst possible time as well. I bet you've got a few stories that you may or may not be able to tell, but there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have a few stories.
All right, buddy. So there's a few interesting things that you're up to at the minute simultaneously. I mentioned them in the intro. Obviously, CyberEdBoard, executive member, fellow ambassador. Can you tell us a bit more about them and what's going down there and how it helps the community and stuff like that, Norman?
Yeah, fellow. It's a networking group actually created by probably somebody who competes with you. He's a recruiter, not necessarily technical, but he's created this as an avenue for people to refine their skills to advisory board work, consulting work, transforming their careers, especially when you're later in life. And I'm going to lead up the technology side. That's the ambassador program in there for fellow. It's pulling people together and giving them an avenue to talk, much like we are, about technology. And it's not just for the technicians, it's for the people in parallel. One individual I talked to who wants to move out of the sales role he's in into more IT sales, technology sales, security sales, or security roles. This is going to give an avenue to do that. So it's a global organization. And part of what we benefit from is build out websites, networking, technology to stay in contact with your network from LinkedIn, which a lot of people aren't at. Lord knows I can always refine that. So that's what Fellow does. You mentioned CyberEdBoard. Again, a group of professionals that's facilitated by the IMG group where they have profiles of members, events to talk about current topics, whether it's incident response, cyber insurance, the next regulations, things like that, along with news, publications, things like that. I'm active in that role there. It's more of being a participant and a contributor. And if you can't tell, I like to be a little bit on the contrarian side. So I do challenge the thought process, and it gives me an avenue to do that in a very collaborative way.
Cool. If you're doing it with another recruiter, Norman, we're going to have to cut this out. I can't have you promoting other recruiters. Sorry. You should have told me that, mate.
No, I think you guys would like each other. You actually complement each other quite well. And to the best of my knowledge, you guys aren't in the same sectors.
Okay, cool. Maybe you could do an intro. Maybe there's some, I don't know, channel sales opportunities or some opportunity there in some way, shape or form. I don't know. Maybe just a nice intro.
Yeah, I'm always up for intros.
Yeah, cool. All right, my friend. Do you know your point there? You mentioned there about the LinkedIn and finding the time and stuff like that. The way that I justify it is, it's if we were recording this years ago, I would have been meeting up with you and we'd be doing it in a studio, or you'd be coming to mine, or I'd be coming to yours, or blah, blah, blah. And there'd be so much more face to face stuff. And my thing is, I'm looking to my right here, Norman, because that's where all the lists are of every job and assignment we've got on. And we are absolutely like, we're busy. But I'm like, hang on, I'm working remote. Like, we're leveraging automations, certain automation things within the agency to make things quicker. So we're hardly traveling anywhere. We're not got the daily commute anymore. I think that's what gives me the mindset to keep posting on LinkedIn, to keep doing the podcast, because we have got a lot of extra time. At some point, you've got to just go, hang on, like we're pretty efficient these days. It's sometimes hard to break out, but we are efficient compared to what we used to, aren't we? Or used to be.
Oh, yeah. So what was your question in there?
I don't even know if I asked one. I think I just basically said, you were talking about LinkedIn and keeping up the profile and stuff like that, and I just basically said, because we're not commuting anymore, because we're remote, we've got way more time. That's what keeps me the mindset to keep the LinkedIn profile going and keep the community, that activity going.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. And I've always been an advocate of networking. I was in a professional business organization in college, and I was in the national leadership role there. And it was really founded on the idea of networking. And at the time, it was in person and through those events. But then that concept still sustains as technology advances. We're doing this remotely. I've had this conversation. I've built relationships with people like you and others we've seen face to face because of Zoom, Google Meets, all this technology. Let's face it, the pandemic created the opportunity for that to manifest it more. But you're right, keeping your profile updated, using it. I view it as, LinkedIn is my profile, my story, not the company I work for, and being dedicated to your profession and who you are versus a single organization. I think that's powerful. And I think that's what you're resonating is pay attention to that. And I can always do better. I also don't beat myself up for not doing it because it's my property, not theirs. I think it's powerful to stay on top of that and seek advice, guidance, be patient.
Yeah, I think it is. I think in a world where I know you mentioned the saying zero trust, I think in today's world, trust is getting lower. Trust probably is at an all-time low. And I think if you've got that activity on there and your personal brand strong, it helps in so many different ways in relation to that.
For sure. Yeah, and you're right. The trust factor and being able to accept the alternative communication mechanisms. The kids today, you go into certain organizations, you take away Slack, they're going to cease to exist, it seems.
Yeah. Do you know what? I'm on Slack because we've got clients on Slack and a Slack group, but we've actually just, as an agency, we've just bitten the bullet and gone onto Slack ourselves. We've actually been doing some internal Slack training. So there you go, mate. Cool. As we come to the end here, I know you're a very informed guy, so this will be a good question to ask you. Podcasts, book, online content, could be security, could be leadership, could be finance or business, could just be general self-improvement. But what book, pod, or content have you consumed any point that has had the most positive impact on you as a person, mate?
A couple things that come to mind, and this is going to date me. 7 Habits of Effective People. That book still resonates with me, and I recommend it even to this day. I am also an advocate of things like Myers-Briggs personalysis, those personality tests that tell you how you think. And keep in mind, Tom, it's how you think, not anything else. It's just be comfortable with how you are. Through those, I know I'm very conceptual and analytical, which creates a certain persona when I'm in a team. So back to when I build teams, I actually use these tools to build the team to know what skills I have and to balance all the roles out. So those two tend to be the most powerful of helping me through this to say, what is my thinking style? The 7 Habits, because it focuses on, what to do. It's things like that. And then obviously I listen to things like CNBC. I pay attention to news blogs, what's happening in the markets. Seems like the number of technical things is just overwhelming. So it varies by week or by year as to who's the most effective and how much of it's translated to Slack now because people are posting things on their own Slacks and all this and LinkedIn stuff. So it's being able to summarize and look at it really quickly.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. And for everyone listening, everything that Norman's just said there, we'll get in the show notes, so it's nice and easy to find. But yeah, just one more point on the chat on the channels. I was listening to a thing the other day. So you get a message and it's, did Norman email me or did he ping me on Slack or was it Signal or was it Telegram? Or maybe he texted me. It's maybe it was on LinkedIn. It's just ridiculous.
Now, if you see the latest Apple Intelligence commercial, the young lady in those actually asks her phone, because at work, because it'll respond here in the room. Ask, where did I meet so-and-so? Or did I meet at? So it goes across all those platforms to tell you that. So think about how we can solve those problems.
Okay, yeah, that's a problem that needs solving, I think.
It does, very much.
Brilliant. Norman, look, an hour has flown by. I know we planned this out. We stuck to some of the plan. We went completely off script for others. I didn't think we were going to be talking about wine and stuff like that and other things, but it's been a good, informative, naturally flowing conversation, mate. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, mate, thanks for your time. Really nice to see you. And yeah, I really genuinely, I enjoyed that.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too.